Right, let's jump into this deep dive. Today we're looking at something called Do You Hear the People Sing? A Call to Action.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And, this is from a group calling themselves Action 25.
Okay.
And they actually sent this directly to us and asked us to help get this out there.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting document. It's written, they call it a tract politique, which I guess is like, back in the day when there was a revolution, they'd be handing out these pamphlets.
It's like Thomas Paine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very much written in that kind of style.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, an interesting choice.
Yeah, it's a very bold move. And one of the things that's really interesting about it is how they're drawing these very direct parallels between modern America and the world that Victor Hugo depicted in Les Misérables.
Yeah, that's a big one, right?
Yeah.
To say that, we're mirroring what was happening in 19th century France.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued, but I think I need some help connecting the dots here.
Sure. So right out of the gate in the first chapter, which they call A Tale of Two Eras, they start by arguing that America under quote unquote 45, that's how they refer to him in the document.
Oh yeah.
They argue that America under 45 is mirroring the social and economic injustices of pre-revolutionary France. So we're talking about extreme economic disparity, a government that seems indifferent to the suffering of its people, and a legal system that seems to favor the wealthy and powerful.
So they're making that direct comparison that just like Hugo's characters were suffering under a monarchy that didn't seem to care about their well-being.
Right.
They're saying that we're seeing that same thing here in modern America under 45.
Yeah. They argue that many Americans today feel similarly trapped in a system that's rigged against them, while a small elite hoard wealth and power.
Yeah, and where does the Tesla Führer fit into all of this?
Oh, that's an interesting question, right? Because, he's this tech innovator. He's not exactly a tyrannical king.
Right.
But that's precisely the point they're trying to make. They claim that, the Tesla Führer, much like the industrialists of Hugo's time, that he's using this illusion of progress to mask the deepening inequality and to exploit workers.
So they're not saying, technology is bad, but they're saying, watch out who's controlling it and who's benefiting from it.
Right, exactly. They want us to look beyond the surface and see the human impact of these technological advancements.
Right. And what's their call to action? What do they want people to do about all this?
Well, they believe that history shows us that oppressed people will eventually rise up, just as they did in Hugo's novel. And so they see this document as a way to kind of ignite that same spirit of resistance in modern America.
Okay. So before we dive into their plan, I think we need to unpack this Les Misérables connection a little bit more.
Yeah.
What is it about this novel that makes them think that it's so relevant to modern America?
Well, that's exactly what chapter 2 is about.
Yeah.
They call it the heroes and struggles of Les Misérables, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of 5 key characters from the novel, and they use their stories as a lens to view contemporary issues.
Okay.
It's actually very clever. It's a way to make their argument much more emotionally engaging and relatable.
So who's the first character they analyze?
Well, you start with Jean Valjean, the ex-convict, who's he's constantly struggling for redemption in a society that denies him a second chance.
Right.
He gets imprisoned for stealing bread to feed his starving family.
Right.
And even after he serves his sentence, he's branded a criminal and he's denied basic opportunities.
Yeah, it's like the system is built to keep him down.
Right.
Even when he's trying to turn his life around.
Exactly. And they're arguing that just like Valjean, many Americans today are denied that true redemption.
Right.
Even when they've paid their dues to society.
Yeah.
They point to things like mass incarceration, the stigma of having a criminal record, and the lack of support for ex-offenders.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, are we really giving people a fair chance?
Yeah.
Okay, so who's next on their list?
Well, they move on to Fantine, the single mother who's driven to these desperate measures by a society that punishes poverty, especially for women.
Right.
She's forced to sell her hair, her teeth, and ultimately her body just to survive and provide for her daughter, Cosette. It's
heartbreaking, but unfortunately it feels all too relevant, even today. We see so many single mothers struggling to make ends meet and facing these impossible choices just to survive.
Absolutely. Action 25 uses Fantine's story to highlight the systemic inequalities that women face, particularly those living in poverty. They argue that without adequate social safety nets and support systems, many women are forced into impossible situations, just like Fantine was.
Right. Okay, so who else did they bring up?
Well, next up are Marius and the revolutionaries. And, you know, they're these young idealists who are willing to risk everything for their beliefs, to fight for a better world. They're full of passion, they're full of conviction, but ultimately their rebellion fails.
Right. It's a tragic but inspiring story. I mean, they fought for what they believed in, even though they knew the odds were stacked against them.
Right.
And Action 25 is seeing a connection between those revolutionaries and
modern protest movements.
Okay.
They see echoes of Marius and his comrades in groups like Black Lives Matter, climate activists, you know, anyone who's challenging the status quo and demanding a more just and equitable society.
So they're saying that even though these movements might not achieve immediate victory, that spirit of resistance is essential for social progress.
Right.
It's about keeping that flame of hope alive,
Yeah.
even in the face of setbacks.
And then they move on to Cosette. And you know, Cosette is she represents, I think, this glimmer of hope in the midst of all this darkness.
Okay.
She's rescued from a life of misery and shows that love and opportunity can actually break these cycles of suffering.
So even in the bleakest of times, there's always that potential for redemption, for renewal.
Right. And I think Action 25 is suggesting that we can create a better future, but it requires a conscious effort to uplift those who've been marginalized and oppressed.
Yeah. Okay. So who's the last character they analyze?
Well, they wrap up their literary analysis with Inspector Javert,
right,
who is you know, the embodiment of rigid law and order.
Right. He's so obsessed with following the rules that he can't even see the human cost of his actions.
Right, exactly. He's blinded by his adherence to the law, that he can't see the need for compassion or mercy.
Right.
And that's precisely the point that Action 25 is trying to make. They're urging us to be wary of these systems that prioritize control and punishment over justice and mercy.
Yeah, it's a powerful framework, this Les Mis framework. I mean, they've really managed to connect a 19th century novel to contemporary issues in a way that's thought-provoking and emotionally resonant. So where do we go from here? I mean, they've set the stage with this analogy, but what's their next move?
Well, in Chapter 3 of The Authoritarian Group of 45, they start getting much more specific about their critique of modern America.
Okay.
And they don't hold back. Yeah, they really start, laying out their argument in this chapter, The Authoritarian Group of 45.
Okay.
And, we were talking about earlier how they're accusing 45 of basically using classic authoritarian tactics to maintain power.
Right.
And they really dig into that in this chapter. You know, they break down what they see as the hallmarks of authoritarianism and how those tactics are used to control the narrative and to silence dissent.
So what kind of tactics are we talking about?
Well, they start by talking about populist rhetoric.
Okay.
And how 45 used it to create this sense of us versus them and to pit different groups against each other.
Right.
It's a classic tactic, to distract people from the real issues and to consolidate power.
Right. Like instead of focusing on economic inequality or systemic problems.
Right.
You get everyone arguing about, immigration or who's more patriotic.
Exactly.
It's divide and conquer.
Exactly. And Action 25 argues that this kind of rhetoric creates this climate of fear and distrust.
Right.
Which then makes it much easier to justify these repressive policies.
So it's not just about the words. It's about creating a certain atmosphere, a certain mindset,
right,
that makes authoritarianism more acceptable.
Right, exactly.
What else do they point to?
Well, they talk about the criminalization of dissent.
Okay.
Remember all those protests that were labeled as un-American or even terrorist,
right,
just for expressing opposition.
Yeah, or how any criticism of 45 was immediately dismissed as fake news or an attack on the country itself.
Right. And Action 25 sees that as a very deliberate strategy to silence dissent and to create a chilling effect on free speech.
Right.
It's about making people afraid to speak out, afraid to challenge those in power.
So it's not even just about controlling what people say. It's about controlling what they even think is acceptable to say.
Exactly.
It's pretty insidious when you think about it.
It is, yeah. And they argue that this kind of repression is often accompanied by an economic agenda that further concentrates wealth and power in the hands of the elite.
Which brings us back to that economic disparity we were talking about earlier.
Right.
So it's like this vicious cycle. You use populist rhetoric to divide people.
Right.
You silence dissent to eliminate opposition.
Right.
And then you implement economic policies that benefit your supporters.
Right.
And further marginalize your opponents.
Exactly. And they argue that this cycle can be incredibly difficult to break.
Once it gets going.
Yeah.
Okay, so where does the Tesla Führer fit into all of this? I mean, we've painted this pretty bleak picture of Thummy 5 and his tactics, but isn't the Tesla Führer supposed to be this symbol of progress and innovation?
Well, that's what's so interesting about Chapter 4, the Tesla Führer and the Illusion of Progress. They argue that he's actually a master at co-opting the language of progress to advance his own agenda.
Oh, cool.
Which they see as just as dangerous as overt authoritarianism.
So how can progress be dangerous?
Well, think about all the talk about disruption and innovation that was happening back then. It sounded exciting.
Yeah, it was all about self-driving cars and colonizing Mars. I mean, it felt like the future was just around the corner.
Exactly, but Action 25 argues that this focus on technological advancement often distracts us from the underlying social and economic issues that are actually getting worse, not better.
So again, they're not saying that technology is inherently bad, but they're saying we need to be critical of who's controlling it.
Exactly.
And who's benefiting from it.
Exactly. And they point to the gig economy, for example. You know, it was touted as this way to empower workers,
right,
give them more flexibility.
Right.
But in reality, it often resulted in lower wages, less job security, and the erosion of worker rights.
Right. And wasn't there a lot of controversy around the Tesla Führer's labor practices, like his opposition to unions and the allegations of worker exploitation in his factories?
Right, exactly. And Action 25 argues that he's essentially using the allure of progress to mask some pretty exploitative practices.
So it's like he's saying, look at all this amazing technology we're creating. Who cares if a few workers get trampled along the way?
Exactly. And they argue that this is where critical thinking and informed skepticism are so important.
Right.
We can't just blindly embrace every new technology or every charismatic leader who promises us a better future.
Right.
We need to think critically about the implications, about the potential costs and benefits, and make sure that progress is actually serving humanity, not the other way around.
Okay, that makes sense. But if the system is so rigged, if the powerful are using these sophisticated tactics to control the narrative and to suppress dissent, why do so many people go along with it? Why don't they rise up and fight back? Well,
that's a question at the heart of Chapter 5, the betrayed followers.
Okay.
And it's a complex one, but Action 25 offers some insights that are really thought-provoking. They argue that it's a combination of nostalgia, fear, and a carefully cultivated cult of personality.
Okay.
That allowed figures like 45 and the Tesla Führer to maintain their grip on power.
Okay, let's break that down. What do they mean by nostalgia?
Well, they argue that 45 in particular was very successful at tapping into people's longing for a simpler time, a time when America was supposedly great. You know, he promised to bring back jobs, restore national pride, make America dominant again.
Right, the Make America Great Again slogan.
Exactly. And they argue that this kind of nostalgia can be very powerful, especially for people who feel like they've been left behind by the modern world.
So it's like a form of escapism, a way to cope with the complexities and anxieties of modern life by clinging to this this romanticized vision of the past.
Right, exactly. And then you add fear into the mix.
Okay.
Action 25 argues that 45 was also a master at stoking people's fears about immigrants, about minorities, about, anyone who's perceived as different or threatening.
Right. There was a lot of talk about taking back our country and protecting ourselves from outsiders.
Exactly. And that kind of fear can make people much more willing to accept authoritarian leadership, especially if it's presented as a way to restore order and security.
Right. So it's like a trade-off. People are willing to sacrifice some of their freedoms in exchange for a sense of safety and security, even if that safety is based on a false premise.
Right. And then there's the cult of personality, which they argue was especially potent in the case of the Tesla Führer.
Yeah, I mean, he had this huge following of people who seemed to worship him as some kind of, visionary genius.
Exactly. And Action 25 argues that this kind of blind adoration can be very dangerous, especially when it's directed towards someone who's already in a position of power.
Right. It's people become so enamored with the persona, with the image, that they lose sight of the actual policies and actions of the person they're following.
Exactly. And that can lead to a situation where people are willing to defend their leader no matter what.
Right.
Even if it means ignoring or excusing their harmful behavior.
So it's this combination of nostalgia, fear, and this carefully constructed image.
Right.
That allowed these figures to amass such a following, even when their actions were clearly harmful to many people.
Exactly. And Action 25 argues that understanding these dynamics is crucial.
Okay.
If we want to resist authoritarianism and build a more just and equitable society.
So they've made their case that America is mirroring pre-revolutionary France. They've broken down the authoritarian playbook. They've explained how 45 and the Tesla Führer managed to gain and maintain power, but where do we go from here? What can we actually do about it?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. In Chapter 6, the organization of the people, they shift gears a bit and they look back at the French Revolution itself.
Okay.
Particularly how ordinary people organized to resist the monarchy.
I know.
It's like you're saying, okay, things are bad, but look, people have fought back against these oppressive systems before and they've won.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Mm-hmm.
What can we learn from the French Revolution that's relevant to our situation today?
Well, they start by talking about the role of pamphlets and salons in spreading revolutionary ideas. Back then, these were the main ways people shared information and debated the issues of the day.
Okay.
They helped to raise awareness, galvanize support, and ultimately, lay the groundwork for a revolution.
So in today's world, that would be like social media, independent news outlets, podcasts like this one.
Exactly.
Anything that allows people to connect and share information outside of the mainstream media.
Right. Action 25 is arguing that we need to create these spaces where people can have open and honest conversations about the issues that matter, where they can challenge the dominant narrative and develop their own understanding of what's happening.
So it's about reclaiming control of the narrative, creating our own media, our own platforms where we can speak truth to power without being censored or silenced.
Right, exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of local assemblies, where people can come together to voice their grievances, share their experiences, and strategize about how to fight back.
So in a modern context, that would be like community organizing, grassroots activism, building power from the ground up.
Exactly. They argue that these local assemblies were crucial in building solidarity and turning individual dissatisfaction into a collective movement for change.
Right. So it's about connecting with your neighbors, building trust, and creating a network of support that can withstand the pressure and intimidation that often come with challenging those in power.
Right. And of course, they also talk about the storming of the Bastille, that iconic moment when the people of Paris rose up and took control of the city.
Right.
That was a pretty dramatic example of what can happen when people reach their breaking point and decide to take direct action.
Yeah, but are they seriously suggesting we need to, storm the Capitol building or something? I mean, I thought they were all about, peaceful resistance.
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's important to clarify that Action 25 is not advocating for violence or reckless action. They're using the storming of the Bastille as a way to illustrate the power of collective action and the potential for dramatic change when people unite and demand it.
So it's more about capturing the spirit of that moment,
Yeah.
the sense of courage and determination that it took to stand up to such a powerful force.
Exactly, exactly. And they also make a point of highlighting the role of women in the French Revolution.
Okay.
Women were actively involved in every stage of the revolution, from spreading ideas to organizing protests to even fighting on the front lines.
Now, they were a crucial part of the movement, even though their contributions are often overlooked in history books.
Right, exactly. And Action 25 is very intentional about highlighting their role, arguing that any successful movement for social change must include and empower women.
So they're drawing on the lessons of the French Revolution to guide us in our own struggle for a more just and equitable society.
Right.
They're showing us that change is possible.
Right.
That ordinary people have the power to challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression.
Exactly. And they're reminding us that this kind of change doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It takes time, it takes organization, it takes courage, and it takes a willingness to learn from the past and adapt those lessons to the challenges we face today.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired, but I'm also a bit overwhelmed. I mean, they've given us this historical framework. They've given us this call to action. But where do we even begin? What does this resistance actually look like in practice?
Well, that's what they tackle in Chapter 7.
Okay.
And it's where things get really specific.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. What's their plan?
It's really interesting how they weave this sense of urgency and this warning about authoritarianism, but then they balance it with a real sense of hope. It's not all doom and gloom.
Right. It's a call to action.
Exactly. They're not just pointing fingers. They're offering a path forward, a way to reclaim our democracy and build a better future. But they're also very clear-eyed about the challenges we face.
Right. In the last part, we were talking about how they draw inspiration from the French Revolution. They see these parallels between the struggles of that era and what's happening in America today. But I gotta admit, I mean, some of their ideas sound pretty radical.
Yeah.
Even a bit, scary.
Right.
Like, are they seriously suggesting that we need to prepare for like a complete societal collapse?
Well, that's where chapters 7 through 9 get really interesting. They delve into the specific ways in which they believe 45 and the Tesla Führer's policies actually harmed the working and middle class.
Okay.
And pushed America closer to that breaking point.
Okay, let's unpack that. What are they pointing to specifically?
Well, they start by taking aim at the tax policies that were enacted under 45.
Okay.
They argue that these policies were designed to funnel wealth upwards to corporations and the ultra wealthy, leaving working families behind.
Right. I remember hearing a lot about trickle-down economics back then.
Right.
But it seemed like the only thing trickling down was more debt and hardship for ordinary people.
Exactly. And Action 25 argues that these policies exacerbated income inequality.
Right.
And created a system where the rich got richer while everyone else struggled to make ends meet.
So it's not just about individual bad actors. It's about a system that's rigged.
Right.
To benefit those at the top.
Right.
And they're saying that this kind of economic inequality is a recipe for social unrest.
Absolutely. They argue that when people feel like the system is fundamentally unfair, when they see a small elite hoarding wealth while they're struggling to put food on the table, it creates this breeding ground for anger, for resentment, and eventually for rebellion.
And it's not just about taxes, right?
Right.
They also talk about the erosion of labor rights and the suppression of wages.
Right, exactly. They point to the decline of unions, the rise of the gig economy, and stagnation of wages as evidence that the system is increasingly stacked against working people.
So it's like a double whammy.
Mm-hmm.
You're making it harder for people to earn a decent living, and you're taking away the tools that would allow them to fight back collectively.
Exactly. And they argue that this trend has serious consequences, not just for the individuals who are struggling, but for the health of our democracy as a whole.
Right, because when people feel economically insecure, they're more likely to be swayed by fear mongering and authoritarian appeals.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And then they go even further, criticizing the dismantling of social safety nets.
Yeah.
They argue that programs like healthcare, education, food assistance, these are essential for a just and equitable society, but that these programs were systematically undermined, leaving people more vulnerable and economically insecure.
So it's like they're pulling the rug out from under people.
Right.
Making it harder and harder to survive and then blaming them for their struggles.
Exactly. And they argue that this is actually a deliberate strategy to create a more compliant and desperate workforce, a population that's too busy just trying to survive to challenge the status quo.
It's pretty big.
It's a pretty bleak picture. But they do offer some hope, right?
Yeah.
They don't just leave us with this sense of despair. Right. Chapters 10 and 11 are all about resistance, about reclaiming our power and building a better future. Chapter 10, The People Will Prevail, is especially powerful.
Okay.
They draw inspiration from the struggles of the characters in Les Misérables,
Right.
to argue that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit of resistance endures.
Okay, give me some of that revolutionary spirit. What's their main message in this chapter?
Well, they start by reminding us that history is full of examples of seemingly invincible regimes that crumbled under the weight of their own corruption and the power of popular resistance.
Right.
They point to the fall of monarchies, of dictatorships, even powerful corporations, as evidence that no system of oppression lasts forever.
So they're saying, don't give up hope. Change is possible, even when it seems impossible.
Exactly. And they tie this back to Les Misérables by highlighting the resilience of the characters, even in the face of immense suffering.
Right.
They talk about Jean Valjean's redemption, Cosette's survival, the sacrifices of the revolutionaries,
Right.
as examples of the enduring human spirit.
So it's about finding hope and inspiration in the stories of those who came before us, those who fought for a better world, even when the odds were stacked against them.
Exactly. And they argue that this kind of hope is essential because it fuels resistance. It gives people the strength to keep fighting, even when the path ahead seems long and uncertain.
Okay, that's inspiring. But what does that hope look like in practice? What are they actually calling for people to do?
That's where Chapter 11 comes in, decentralized resistance, a multi-front strategy.
Okay.
And here they lay out this very detailed plan for resisting authoritarianism and building a more democratic and just society. It's a call to action. It's a blueprint for change, and it's directed at you, the listener.
Okay, I'm ready. What's their plan?
Well, they propose this multi-pronged approach, what they call decentralized resistance.
Okay.
And it involves 7 key initiatives. They've clearly put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah.
And they're presenting it as this comprehensive strategy for taking back our democracy.
Okay, let's break it down. What's the first initiative?
Well, the first one is the People's Labor Alliance. Or PLA. And this is all about empowering workers to fight back against corporate exploitation.
Okay.
So they call for, unionizing workers in industries that are dominated by figures like the Tesla Führer. They talk about organizing nationwide strikes for better wages and benefits, boycotting companies that support politicians like 45.
So it's about hitting the economic elite where it hurts their profits. It's about recognizing that economic power translates into political power and that we need to challenge that power if we want to create a more equitable society.
Exactly. Next, they propose the Democracy Defense Network, or DDN.
Okay. And this one focuses on protecting voting rights, combating political corruption, and strengthening democratic institutions. So they call for things like flooding local election boards with volunteers, challenging corrupt politicians, even taking over state legislatures to pass voter protection laws.
Sounds like they're advocating for a multifaceted approach to defending democracy, working both within the system and outside of it to challenge those who are trying to undermine it.
Exactly. Then there's the Economic Resistance Coalition, or ERC.
Okay.
And this is about redirecting wealth away from corporations and billionaires and building a more equitable and sustainable economy.
Okay.
They advocate for things like, moving your money to local banks and credit unions, supporting worker-owned cooperatives, creating alternative economic systems that prioritize people and planet over profit. So it's about building like a parallel economy, a system that operates outside of the traditional power structures and serves the needs of the many, not just the few.
Right.
Okay, what else is on their list?
Well, they also call for a Truth and Media Strike Force, or TMSF.
Okay.
And this is to combat propaganda and disinformation.
Right.
So they advocate for exposing and challenging fake news, supporting independent media, teaching people how to be more critical consumers of information.
So recognizing that information is power.
Right.
And that we need to be vigilant in defending the truth against those who would manipulate it for their own gain.
Exactly.
It's about reclaiming the narrative.
Right.
And creating spaces where honest and open dialogue can flourish.
Right, exactly. And then there's the Direct Action Network, or DAN.
Okay.
And this one focuses on organizing protests, legal challenges, acts of civil disobedience to directly confront authoritarian policies and demand change.
So it's about taking to the streets, making our voices heard, refusing to be silenced, channeling that spirit of the storming of the Bastille, but in a peaceful and strategic way.
Exactly. They also call for a Community Defense Corps, or CDC, to protect vulnerable communities.
Right.
Those who are most at risk under authoritarian rule. So this involves things like creating sanctuary networks, training communities in de-escalation and self-defense, building underground resource sharing networks.
So it's about recognizing that the fight for democracy is also a fight for the safety and dignity of all people. Right. Not just the majority. It's about standing up for those who are most vulnerable, even when it's dangerous to do so.
Exactly. And finally, they propose the Shadow Governance Initiative, or SGI.
Okay.
And this is probably the most radical of their initiatives, and it involves preparing for the possibility of a complete societal collapse. Creating parallel governing structures, training local leaders in emergency response, establishing independent supply chains.
It's a pretty grim scenario, but I can see why they feel it's necessary to plan for the worst case scenario.
Right. And they emphasize that this initiative needs to be very discreet and decentralized.
Right.
To avoid being labeled as, treasonous or seditious.
Right, yeah.
It's about preparing for the possibility of a broken system, while still fighting to save the existing one.
It's a bold plan, to say the least.
Yeah.
But do they really think they can pull this off?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like they're up against some pretty powerful forces.
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't think they have all the answers. But they end on a note of hope and determination.
Okay.
Urging people to remember that the future is not predetermined. They believe that by organizing, by resisting, by working together, we can reclaim our democracy and build a better world.
So what does it all mean? What's the final takeaway from Do You Hear the People Sing?
Well, I think it's a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's a challenge to examine our own assumptions, to question the systems we live in, and to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to create?
And it's a reminder that we're not powerless.
Right.
Even in the face of these immense challenges, there's always hope.
Right.
There's always the possibility of change.
But that change doesn't happen on its own. It requires action. It requires courage. It requires a willingness to stand up and fight for what we believe in, even when the odds seem stacked against us.
And it requires us to listen, to really hear the voices of those who are struggling, those who are demanding a more just and equitable world.
Right. And they end with that that powerful image from Les Misérables.
Yeah.
People singing, their voices rising in defiance,
right,
demanding justice and a better world. It's a stirring image, and I think it's meant to be both inspiring and challenging. They're asking us, can you hear that song?
Right.
Will you join the chorus?
That's a powerful question, and one that we all need to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because the answer ultimately is up to each of us.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought and inspired you to take action. Remember, the future is not set in stone. We have the power to shape it together.